Very bad start for the whole weekend. It's actually the first in a series of debates called the Battle for Morality this morning, so I'm going to briefly say why we want to have a series of debates about moral issues today, and then I'll introduce this particular session on evil, and then my panel, and we'll get into it. I'll explain about how it's going to work. The first thing I suppose to say about having a series of debates on morality is that it's not about moralism. These won't be discussions, I hope, involving people telling you, do this, don't do that. It's more about, I think it's actually a series of discussions about freedom, in the sense that if we recognize ourselves as free agents who can make choices in the world, the nature of those choices are moral choices. They are choices about how we should behave and what kind of world we think that we should live in. And that word should is a clue, I think, to the moral nature of those choices. So with evil, fairly obviously, there are choices to be made, or at least I think you can make choices between good and evil in the world. We're going to have a session on marriage in the modern era. What is the nature of that choice? Is it a commitment for life, or is it an excuse for a very good party, spending a lot of money and having your picture in Hello? Drugs, if they were legalized, should you take them? Because I think one of the things that will probably come up in the course of the discussions today is examining the situation in which you're permitted to do something. But it doesn't mean that you should, just because it's allowed. You might want to consider whether or not it fitted into your idea of a good life. And we also have a session on sex. Obviously, since the permissive society, there's very little that's not allowed in terms of your sexual behaviour by society. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean you should do all of it. Or, for example, treat abortion as a form of contraception because you're lazy about what you get up to on a Saturday night. And finally, I think to bring it all together, there can be some consequences for making the wrong choices. So we're going to finish up with a session on crime and punishment, where there can be some very serious results if you make the wrong choices. And we want to examine just what we think the role of punishment in prisons are for in society. So a long series of discussions. Hopefully you can stay for some or all of them. But we are going to start with evil, and I just wanted to quote Hannah Arendt, who is a German sociologist, who in 1945, I think, made a very prescient comment. Just at the end of the war, she said, "The problem of evil will be the fundamental question of post-war intellectual life in Europe, as death became the fundamental problem after the First War." And that says something to me. I don't know what it means to you. She certainly went on to develop the theory of the banality of evil, which is often discussed in her reflections on the Eichmann trial in the 60s. And people have a lot of disagreement about what she meant by the banality of evil. I think she meant that evil for her was more akin to nothingness, if you like. Something that had no depth, that couldn't be grasped, was an absence of meaning in the world. And one of the reasons I wanted to put this session on today is that I think I can see tendencies or trends in society at the moment to want to flatten out complexity, to bring the aid of science to hand, say, no, these things are straightforward and not complex because the evidence shows that it's this way. I mean, that has two effects, of course. One, to lessen, if not remove, your moral freedom, because if things just are that way, if you can derive what you should do from the way things are in the world, derive the ought from the is, as philosophers have it, then it's pretty easy for you to decide what to do. It's kind of mapped out. So that reduction of complexity, I'd like to explore whether or not we might think that would amount to a reduction in our moral freedom, in our choice making, but also possibly open a door of some kind to evil in the world. So, that's my brief introduction to get you thinking maybe. The way these sessions work, I'm conscious that a lot of people here probably may not have been to the Battle of Ideas before, but my panel are going to give us brief introductions, no more than 6 to 8 minutes, on what they think about the issue. And then I'll have a conversation between them on the panel before we go out to you. And that's a very important part of all the debates this weekend. We do intend these to be genuine public discussions, so don't feel that there are any limits on propriety. There's nothing you're not allowed to do in terms of asking questions, making points, and putting the panel under pressure if you disagree with what they're saying. So we'll do that, and I'll take questions and points in rounds of 3 or 4, 5 at a time, and bring the speakers back at regular intervals or when they sort of elbow me and demand a chance to respond. So in terms of my panel, and in the order they're going to speak, first of all on my left we have Mark Vernon, who's spoken a number of times before the Battle of Ideas. Mark's a philosopher, a prolific author, recently written How to Be an Agnostic and the Meaning of Friendship. He used to be a priest, which hopefully will give him some insights into evil, even though he may have turned his back on them. He's degrees in physics, theology and philosophy, a regular journalist and public lecturer, and a very keen blogger, well worth following at markvernon.com. Mark will also be speaking tomorrow morning on aliens. Early tomorrow morning is their life out there, which I think will be worth coming to see as well. So thank you for joining us, Mark. Then next to speak on my far right there, Professor Simon Baron-Cohen, who's a professor of psychology and psychiatry at Cambridge, very famous, world famous for studies in autism, and he runs the Autism Research Centre there in Cambridge. He's just written, which is one of the inspirations for this session, a book called 0 Degrees of Empathy, which is directly tackling the problem of evil and trying to explain it in terms of science and neuroscience and an absence of empathy. It's a study of human cruelty in the world. It's a very good book, and I think it will be available in the bookstore upstairs as well as afterwards. And maybe, Simon, you can sign some copies if people are interested. It's well worth reading. I profoundly disagree with everything in the book. As it happens, I think it's fair to say I dispute the idea we'll find an empathy gene, but I'm very happy to debate it. I'm glad that, Simon, you've come along to debate it as well, so thank you. Third to speak on my right is Professor David Jones. He's the director of the Anscombe Bioethics Centre, which was founded in 1977. I think it used to be the Lineker Centre in Oxford, founded by the Catholic bishops of England and Wales. Before that, he was director of the Centre for Bioethics and Emerging Technologies at St Mary's University in Twickenham. And he chairs also the Ministry of Defence's Research Ethics Committee. He's just written a book, again I think it'll be in the bookshop, called Angels, a very short introduction, which may seem an odd thing to plug in a session on evil, but remember the angels include the big bad one as well. So there's a chapter on our friend the fallen angels, so that might be worth a look as well. And he also wrote a very important book called The Soul of the Embryo. Again, I think I may disagree on some things with David, but I know he also loves a very good debate on this issue. So thank you, David. And to speak last, Kenan Malik on my left here is an old friend of the Institute of Ideas. He's been involved in many of our discussions over the last 10 years. He's a prolific writer, lecturer, and broadcaster. You can hear him on the Moral Maze on Radio 4 as a regular panellist there, and he also presents the Radio 4 programme Analysis. He's writing a book at the moment, and he's written a lot, very important books, like from Fatwa to Jihad and the Soham and Rushdie affair, a number of books on race called Strange Fruit. It's a very good one I would recommend. But at the moment he's working a book called The Quest for a Moral Compass, a history of moral thought. I really think from Alpha to Omega is you coming right up to the modern days. That's a big project. I've been able to look at some of the opening chapters of that, and I know it will be very good coming out next summer, I hope. So, as well, Kenan is a regular, prolific journalist, very big in Scandinavia and Europe, and will have a lot to say on this issue. So thank you for joining us, Kenan. So, Mark, you kick us off.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm all for evil, as a concept that is, and I know that people can get very nervous about its use because they feel that it's not diagnostic, but risks obscuring and failing to understand what's at stake in evil acts. But I think it serves a useful purpose. One is purely as a form of expression. It was pure evil. I think that serves to help to hold relativism at bay, if you like, and serves an expressive function, which I wouldn't want to belittle, actually. I think also that it holds the horror in view. There's a great risk, I think, that in trying to explain, we actually explain away. And I think that if we're going to try and come to terms with anything that might be worthy of the name evil, we need to try and be able to look the horror in the face, which is harder to do than perhaps we assume. But I think it's also good to try and keep a distinction between trying to understand and actually explaining something. I think in science this is a very common distinction that's made. Physicists will try to understand the cosmos, but few physicists will claim they've explained it. And I think too that evil, there is something unspeakable about evil, and so we shouldn't be fearful of saying that as well. Now I wanted to offer, partly to kick us off, to offer the traditional Christian viewpoint, because I think it does have very useful insights into what evil might be. It can be summed up in a couple of words, actually, as Thomas Aquinas, the medieval theologian, put it, which is privatio boni, a lack of goodness, privation of goodness. And this you might interpret in many ways. You might say evil is a lack of value, nihilistic. This is very much the idea that Terry Eagleton goes for in his book On Evil, where he makes a very nice comparison between the reason why slime often designates evil is because slime is materially undifferentiated and evil is moral undifferentiation. So lack of value, nihilism would be one, lack of goodness. A lack of virtue or lack of practical intelligence. It's knowing how life could be, but not going for it, if you like. And I think this is actually partly what Arendt was onto. She was a very good Aristotelian, did her PhD, I believe, on Augustine, and so knew about eudaimonistic ethics. In a way, it's the banality of evil might be a kind of unskillful life that gets out of control. And so has a complete lack of virtue in it. Another lack might be that which comes from psychotherapeutic understandings, which might be a lack, say, of appropriate and good attachment at some stage in early life that leads to psychosis, and some of the manifestations of that might warrant the word evil. But again, the point is it's a lack of something that wasn't as it's supposed to be. A lack of meaning, too, would be another way in which evil would fit into this category. I was recently reading the essay that Joseph Brodsky wrote on evil, and he reflects on the Christian notion of turning the other cheek. And he says the other cheek here sets in motion not the enemy's sense of guilt, which he is perfectly able to quell, he says, but exposes his senses and faculties to the meaningless of evil. So the act of turning the other cheek is supposed to expose the meaningless of evil. And then, of course, we have the famous phrase from Burke, it's only necessary for the good man to do nothing for evil to triumph. And again, that nothingness, that lack, is what comes through there. So I think there's just a useful distinction to make here. One is that evil is not the opposite of good. It's the absence of good. And there's a difference there, because a lot of ethical thinking, I think, is a bit binary or dualistic. Utilitarianism, you go for pleasure, not for pain. In deontological ethics, you do right or wrong, as if they're kind of binary oppositions. And this Christian and Aristotelian, I think, understanding of evil is that evil is an absence. It's not the opposite of good. So evil and good are related not as north is to south, but as north is to not north. And that, I think, helps clear up some of the confusion which can emerge. Similarly, Christianity teaches that no one's intrinsically evil because creation is made good. But everyone is capable of evil because life is both free and it's fragile. Free and fragile. And I think this is what fundamentally impels us in the West to want to try to understand evil. In the ancient world, in the Christian world, of course, it hung a lot around words like sin, trying to understand what sin is, and the great theologians wrote many books on what sin might be, trying to understand both the freedom element there and the fragility element, the original sin element, if you like. And I think that spills into modern understandings too, say in psychotherapy, as I mentioned, or in Arendt's attempt to understand evil. So I'd say that evil is fundamentally a moral issue. Whatever else we try to bring to the picture to try to understand it, and it's a lack of goodness, and goodness meant in this Aristotelian sense. Life is not as it's supposed to be, and perhaps even more strongly, it is as it is supposed not to be. Life as it is supposed not to be, in fact, in some sort of basic or fundamental sense. So I hope that gets us sort of kicked off. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to just take a different view, which is that when we're trying to understand acts of human cruelty, we shouldn't use the term evil, because it's not really an explanation. So I'm speaking as a psychologist and a scientist, and as a scientist seeking explanations, we often hear of explanations put forward that he or she did something bad because they are evil. And it's that because word which presents itself as if it's an explanation, but when you analyse the term, it's not really an explanation at all. What we've just heard is that the definition of evil is, or one definition is, the absence of good. So effectively we're into a circular argument. We're saying he or she did something bad because they aren't good. What I'm arguing in my book is that we should replace the term evil with the term erosion of empathy. So I'm shifting the focus onto a psychological process ultimately rooted in the brain, empathy, and I'm going to argue that this is scientifically more tractable because empathy is something that you can measure. I'm happy to talk about both psychological attempts to measure it, but also using the new brain scanning technology to get images of it. And a second point is that empathy lies on a spectrum. So it's not that you either have empathy or you don't, but there are degrees of empathy. So empathy, when you do measure it psychologically, seems to show the familiar bell curve. That's to say, most of us are in the average range, but there are some people who are very high in empathy, but equally people all the way over to the extreme who are very low in empathy. And what scientists have as a puzzle ahead of them is to understand or explain what determines where we lie on that empathy spectrum. So we all lie somewhere on that, and there are some people who are way over at the extreme with 0 degrees of empathy. I haven't said anything about the definition of empathy. For me, there are at least 2 distinct components. The first is the ability to identify what someone else is thinking or feeling. So that's to say, putting yourself into someone else's shoes to imagine their thoughts and feelings. That's the recognition element. Psychologists sometimes call that the cognitive part of empathy. The other part is the response. So having an appropriate emotional response to what someone else is thinking or feeling. And psychologists call that the affective component. And I think you need both parts to say that somebody has empathy. So if we imagine a psychopath for a second, who is very capable of recognizing that their victim is in pain, they can do one part of empathy, that's the recognition element, but they don't have that natural emotional response, appropriate emotional response of wanting to alleviate someone else's distress or suffering. So they have the cognitive element, but not the affective element. And the argument is that when empathy is reduced, either because you're missing part of it or you just have very low levels of it, the brakes are no longer there on your behaviour. Suddenly everything becomes possible. So when we're talking about making choices, I think we also have to understand what are the normative processes that put brakes on our behaviour so that we don't just do anything that we like. The other thing I want to mention is a bit about the neuroscience, because over the last 5 to 10 years, neuroscience has been making great progress in identifying where empathy takes place in the brain. And what seems to have emerged is that empathy isn't located in a single place in the brain. There's a network of regions, which could be called the empathy circuit, and that when we try to understand someone else's feelings and respond with an emotion to someone else's feelings, that whole circuit gets activated. When we look at people with medical conditions where empathy is very low, like people with some of the personality disorders, I've mentioned psychopaths already, those parts of the empathy circuit are underactive. You can see that when you use MRI scanning, or they haven't developed in the normal way. So the neuroscience is showing us that empathy has a special circuit in the brain, and that circuit can either fail to develop in the normal way, or can go down in a temporary way. The last thing I wanted to mention is the idea of what determines the functioning of that circuit, the empathy circuit. So Angus briefly mentioned the idea of an empathy gene, and I think there are very few scientists that would say that any aspect of human behaviour is entirely genetically determined. These days we recognise a more nuanced gene-environment interaction, but certainly there's plenty of evidence that early experience contributes to how much empathy you end up with. I think Mark briefly mentioned attachment, the idea that if you experience caring, affectionate parenting in your own childhood, you become capable of showing empathy or caring for others in your later relationships, and there's plenty of evidence for that. The clearest coming from people with borderline personality disorder, who in adulthood can be very impulsive and lash out at other people, either verbally or physically. And when you look back at their childhoods, some 80% of them suffered neglect or abuse in their early childhood. So there's a very clear link between the experience you've had of feeling cared for and your capacity to care for others in adulthood. But early experience is not the whole story. I think there will be a place for genetic factors. And we know that from twin studies, that when you compare identical twins on measures of empathy or callousness, you see a greater similarity in identical twins than you do in non-identical twins, suggesting that there is a genetic component. But I want to stress both genes and environment are important. Thank you.
I'll admit I'm no scientist, so don't hold me to anything I say about genetics, and I often find science of facts of profound irrelevance to any of these moral questions. But I think we're maybe going to have an argument on the panel. David, your thoughts?
Yes. In Gulliver's Travels, I think it's when he goes to Laputa, he meets various scientists there, and one scientist he meets has got a solution to part of the political problems in the country at the time, the political problems of the countries. He thought there was the two parties which were very divided, always arguing with one another, and he thought that if you took politicians who had roughly similar sized heads, and you divided their brains in half, and took part of one brain, swapped half of brain with one another, then the argument could go on inside the head. And then it wouldn't have to spill out and spoil the polity. So I'm glad to see that arguments of that ilk are still with us. I'd like to talk about Satan, who if we're going to talk about evil, I think ought to be invited to the party. There's a kind of caricature, I suppose, of religious views of evil, which has something in it, which is that evil, you have a force of light and force of darkness which are battling against one another, a kind of Lord of the Rings view, where you have a realm of good and you have a realm of evil, and they're struggling against one another. And you see that, you have a sort of a demon on one shoulder and an angel on the other. It's a way of portraying evil as this kind, in a kind of binary way. We already heard about that. And that is, there is an element of that in religious thought, and I suppose that's part of the function that the devil has. But it's almost immediately problematic from a religious point of view. If you're a monotheist, if you just have the one God, how you could have a evil which is in any way on the same level. So going back to Judaism, but it's the same in Christianity and Islam, and no doubt takes different forms for the other non-Abrahamic religions. But within these traditions, you can't have the God and the devil be the same kind of thing. They can't be on the same level, because there's nothing on the same level as God. There's only the one God, or perhaps opening up to the Unitarians, I should say, there is at most one God. So if we admit that there is at most one God, then the devil can't be on the same level as God. So how do you think of goodness and evil? Well, we've already heard. I mean, I hate to be agreeing with. I hope we'll have some good disagreements as well. But with a lot of what Mark said, but rather than having a binary view, while not having a binary view, Christians and Jews came to reject the idea that you can have pure evil. In the Time Bandits, at the end of the Time Bandits, they come across the substance of pure evil, which is what's a bit like coal, and somebody holds it. Now, that's not a view which is compatible with say, Christianity or Judaism. You can't get hold of pure evil, because evil is always parasitic on some good. It's always a lack of some good, a perversion of some good. And therefore, in order to understand what's evil, you have to understand the good. Because what's good for one kind of thing is not good for another. What's good for a squirrel is not good for a tree. And what's good for human beings, if we're talking about evil in human beings, you have to understand the human good. So to give an account of evil, you have to really have a rich idea of what a good life would be. And one element of that would be empathy, and I think I will agree with some things which said about empathy. But empathy is only one aspect of good, and sometimes actually we need to stand back. We don't need to empathise too much. Sometimes we need to be aggressive. Sometimes we need to assert ourselves. We need to have assertiveness training in order not simply to agree all the time. We often, unfortunately, we are attached empathetically to some and not for others. So we have to have a sense of justice, and the sense of justice is not simply about what feelings are immediately presented to us, but it needs to engage our reason. And I don't think we'll find that kind of engagement by looking, for example, at neurosciences. So there are other aspects to the good, and there are various things that can go wrong, so that the wicked people are wicked in different ways. And we may think of we may think of the psychopath who murdered somebody in Richmond Park. Oh, he's not really all human. There's something lacking, and that lack might go back to childhood. It might be something genetic, and I have sympathy with that. But we also think, well, who let him out, and why did they let him out? And the psychiatrist that signed that off, was he responsible enough? Did he have a bad day? If he wasn't sufficiently responsible, if he was lazy, for example, or had a different agenda, like had an agenda that he had to empty his hospital for various reasons, then we would get very angry. We get very angry with him, because he is making moral choices. And the kind of moral choices are not simply about empathy. You might say he's not empathising enough with his victims, but it's more about fulfilling a role which is complex, which has all kinds of responsibilities within society, and ultimately, I'm afraid, is political. So without a stronger sense of what it is to flourish as a human being, what is good for us, and what it is to live well politically in society, we can't really have an understanding of evil, because evil is always an absence or a rejection or a perversion of some good.
Thanks, Angus. I think part of the trouble in discussing evil is confusion about the kind of debate we're having. two kinds of moral debates we can have. One is a debate about normative ethics. Is abortion good? Is torture bad? And so on. And the other is about meta-ethics. What anchors our morality? What is the ultimate justification for our view that abortion is good or bad, torture is good or bad, and so on? And the two are linked, but they are separate, of course. And when we talk about evil, we often think we're having a debate about normative ethics. We're actually having a debate about meta-ethics, the more fundamental questions of where our morality comes from. So when you say something like, Hitler is bad, or Hitler is evil, you're not saying the same thing as when you say torture is bad, or torture is evil. What we're actually doing is making a claim about the boundaries of morality, and a claim about the nature of human being, the nature of what it is to be a moral being. To talk about evil, it seems to me, is to define a space within which it's possible to have a debate that we can meaningfully call moral. For example, somebody might say that torture is wrong in all circumstances, even the famous ticking bomb scenario. Somebody else might say torture, the torture of terrorists is acceptable if it provides vital information that may save lives. And those two people would profoundly disagree. But those two people would probably also agree that they were talking the language of morality, that they were at different places, if you like, within that moral landscape. But if someone were to say torturing terrorists is fun and it's an unalloyed good, you probably wouldn't imagine he's talking in terms of morality at all. In other words, he's beyond the boundary of what you think is acceptable moral space. And it seems to me that when we talk about evil, what we're doing is actually defining that boundary and saying what is acceptable moral talk and what isn't acceptable moral talk. The problem with that is the other issue you're doing actually is defining what it is to be a moral creature. So everybody from the Christian view about the fall and the wretchedness of human being and the sin that the fall brings into the world, to Simon's view about that what we need to do is redefine morality or redefine evil as deficiency in empathy. Both, in fact, are different visions of human nature, and both try and use their view of evil to try and justify, legitimate, and put forward a particular vision of what it is to be human. And one's vision of what it is to be human, one's vision of human nature, is both a way of defining your moral boundaries, and it's a way of legitimising those moral boundaries too. And those moral boundaries help legitimise how one sees what it is to be human. Now, if you take the famous phrase that Dostoevsky never said, which is, without God, everything is permitted, he never wrote that, but there's that sentiment clearly runs through most of his work, and it's a view that most religious believers would hold to. The point is that it's not just religion that requires boundaries in that sense. All moralities, secular or religious moralities, require certain boundaries. Without boundaries, there can be no moral thought. The problem is, using a concept such as evil to police those boundaries itself is problematic, because it undermines the possibility of moral thought, and it does it so in a number of ways. Evil is about the transgression of moral boundaries. I mean, it's interesting, if you look historically, the notions of evil, sin, and transgression are often seen as synonymous. It's about defining those who transgress as, in a certain way, heretics, as inhabiting a space beyond what is acceptable. And secular moral codes do that as much as a religious moral code. And in so doing, one cuts off moral debate, cuts off, defines those with which whom you disagree as beyond the moral space, as being, in a certain sense, evil. And the growth in recent times of notions of evil, and people adopting certain moral positions as being evil is a very good indication of that. And in using evil to police certain boundaries, saying that certain acts or thoughts or beliefs beyond the boundaries are evil, it's a way of not just of rendering them unspeakable, but also inexplicable. Evil becomes often seen as an act without purpose. Mark mentioned, I think it was Terry Eagleton's books on evil, where Terry Eagleton makes a point that evil is supremely pointless. Anything as humdrum as a purpose would tarnish its lethal purity, he says. Well, take the Holocaust, the defining event in most contemporary discussions of evil. The death camps, the genocide, all had, from an artist's point of view, purpose. They weren't pointless in the way that Eagleton would have it. Evil is not acting without a purpose, it's acting with a purpose, but the one that falls outside the boundaries of what one conceives of as being moral. And in rendering evil inexplicable in that fashion, creating a boundary actually does disservice to reason, to our ability to prevent the repetition of such evil. The concept of evil, it seems to me, also renders boundaries absolute. I mean, that's the whole point about it. There are certain boundaries that are regarded as absolute, that one must not transgress, one must not cross. But again, take the Holocaust. And today it's regarded as the expression of absolute evil, and Hitler as the embodiment, the very embodiment of evilness. Well, a millennium ago, Hitler, there would have been nothing unexceptional, or most people would have seen little unexceptional or exceptional about Hitler, that he would have been one among many of his kind. And few would have been horrified at anything as barbaric as death camps. The fact that we now see the Holocaust symbolically as a kind of the moral line that must not be crossed is because our moral views have transformed. It's because over time we've come to recognise the immorality of racism, of genocide and so on. We have come to see the Holocaust as an absolute moral boundary, in other words, only because those boundaries are not absolute, because they shift over time, because there is something what we call moral change, or better still, moral progress. And if those boundaries were absolute, we would today be looking at the Holocaust in a very different way than we do today. It would not play that symbolic role that it does today. And I think what all this suggests is that the concept of evil, it seems to be, expresses the predicament of being human. Not just the fact that humans are capable of the most atrocious of acts as well as the most generous, but also the fact that the human condition is that of possessing no moral safety net. I mean, can't one throw that every man is his own moralist, meaning that humans make their own moral laws, we establish our own boundaries. But to say that morality is humanly created is not to say that morality is arbitrary or subjective. The fact that we see the Holocaust as evil is an expression, as I said, of moral progress. Human society has become, in that sense, more moral, and it's become more rational. And the difficulty, it seems to me, we have been thinking about evil and in thinking about morality, is that we have difficulty in thinking about morality as both humanly created and yet not arbitrary. Which is why debates about morality and about evil is usually polarised between those who want to see morality and evil as absolute on the one hand and as relative on the other. That there's this kind of polarisation between the absoluteness and the relativeness of morality. And in a sense, if we want to get over, if we want to have a rational debate about evil, the real question about evil is not does it exist, but why do we debate it, and why is it such a contentious, problematic view? And it seems to me it's such a contentious, problematic view precisely because we're caught between the idea of morality as human created and the idea of morality as if it's as being arbitrary. The way to think about evil in a different fashion, the way to think about morality in a different fashion, is to be able to create the idea of morality as humanly created, but also as something not arbitrary, something that is rational in human terms.
Okay, thank you all very much. We've got quite a range of views there, obviously, from evil as the absence of evil, absence of good, to evil just as maybe not existing, that there are degrees of wickedness, to there being no such thing, it's an absence of something else, kind of thing. So a lot to discuss. I won't keep the panel long before we go out to you, so start thinking of questions, but I suppose I want to pick up from where Kenan left off and sort of ask all of you to come back on what you think. Because it's not, I think there's sort of an increase in the willingness to see evil in the world, not just the Holocaust, but if we look at the house of Fred and Rosemary West, which was demolished in 1996 or something, and the stones ground up by the council. The same thing happened to Ian Huntley's house, the Soham murder, and the BBC, who said it was important to expunge the sense of evil associated with these evil bricks, and they had to be ground up as well. Or Osama bin Laden's body being buried at sea, Gaddafi recently, axis of evil. The entire Catholic Church is evil with a capital E if you pick up any daily newspaper, because we know what goes on behind closed doors, don't we? There are a lot of accusations of evil. But at the same time, in society, we have the view that Simon's expressing is that there's no such thing, that we can explain things at medical level. So what allows these two seemingly contradictory views to coexist in society? On the one hand, a kind of more popular account of evil, which it's my feel that we're seeing more of, maybe is a desire for moral absolutes to exist in the world. Terry Eagleton's argument is that the desperate acts of frustration of a murderer like Anders Breivik in Norway are a frustration born to prove that absolute acts are actually possible in a world of moral relativism where anything goes, but there's nowhere to stand, if you like. So what explains the both more and less of evil at the same time in the world? So anybody? Simon?
Just jumping in first, I think that both views can coexist because, as Mark said in his opening remarks, evil is a very useful concept for expressing our horror at awful things. So we need a word in our vocabulary which says something isn't just bad, it's not just very bad, it's very, very, very bad, etc. And so evil gives us a word for that extreme expression. But if you're trying to use it as an explanation, I think that's where I, as a scientist, have difficulties, and where I think we do need alternative viewpoints, looking at the components of the human mind. And just picking up on Kenan's last point about the human need to establish boundaries. At what point do we say something is unacceptable, or it's a transgression too far? I think that in any point in history and in any culture, there will be rules about what is acceptable or unacceptable. But there are sometimes individuals who, even though they're told it's okay to do such and such a thing, don't do it. So if we take apartheid South Africa, where it was morally acceptable, it was sanctioned to treat blacks differently to whites. Nevertheless, there were some people who didn't do that because they didn't feel that it was just or that it was caring. So it wasn't about whether it was allowed legally or by some code of rules. It was about whether it felt right. Mark?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I really don't think that this word evil means no understanding, no application of reason. You know, from Thomas Aquinas to Hannah Arendt, these were people that understood evil as an absence, but they still try to understand it. Perhaps what it means is there's a limit to our understanding of these very, very big things. The other thing I just wanted to ask Simon, actually, in relation to this perhaps, is I always wonder whether empathy can sort of do the work that's asked of it in these kind of moral contexts. And I'm thinking about the work which you'll know much better than I do about in-groups and out-groups, and it strikes me that a warring nation may be highly empathic towards its in-group, and that is the very thing that makes it capable of perpetrating atrocities against an out-group. And I'm thinking about the origin of the word too. It's about 100 years old, I understand, and it comes actually from aesthetics, and the idea was feeling into in German, and that can be quite an invasive activity too, actually. It's not necessarily an unalloyed good. Certainly in the psychotherapeutic world, there's been a lot of effort to try and understand how empathy can be used in positive ways. But that's all premised on the idea that it's not just a whole good. It's not, you know, maximal empathy does not necessarily maximal goodness. If zero empathy is evil, then you know, maximal empathy is not just goodness. So I just wonder whether empathy can really do the work that's asked of it. So you often hear it these days, but I have questions about that.
Let's come back on that.
Yeah, quickly, and then David.
And just a brief response, which is that I think that what low empathy does is it sets the stage for acts of cruelty. It's not that low empathy automatically leads to acts of cruelty, but it's a precondition for it.
Thanks,
David.
Yeah, I think that because human beings are complex and it's difficult to cope with even our own complexity, certainly the complexity of others, there's a tendency to concentrate on one aspect or another aspect. And in the 19th century, often aggression was picked up as what evil was, so you had too much aggression and maybe we could get rid of too much aggression and that's the problem. And so passivity was a good thing, aggression, and that's why we have to now learn to be appropriately assertive. But then also there was a concern about having too much desires. Excessive desire was what caused evil. So you've got concerns about too much desire, concerned about too much aggression, but there's an appropriate kind of desire, and there's an appropriate kind of aggression. And similarly with empathy, I think it's part of the package that we do feel for. And you can see perhaps, if you take warring nations, I mean, if the degree of difference is such so that there isn't a real recognition of being like us, then there can be greater acts of cruelty in certain kinds of wars, whereas wars where the enemy is more like us, you might have less. On the other hand, the worst kind of atrocities tend to happen in civil wars. And this is quite a pattern. I mean, in the English civil war, and it's strange that once you transgress that boundary of people who you recognise as your brothers, then all hell breaks loose. So it does seem to be that it's not simply there is a problem about being too distant. There is a problem about too distant, but there is also a problem about being too close. And you can also see this politically. So a party. The real anger in a party is always within the two groups within the party about who represents the real, whatever it is, socialism, and they expect the opposite to be, the opposite party to be ordinarily evil. You know, they know they're evil, but what they get really worked up about is the people in their own party, and so it's strangely that your closeness can up the stakes. But it doesn't stop people from getting angry, and it doesn't stop people from doing the wrong thing, sometimes very, very wrong. So I'd say don't try and reduce it just to...
Yeah, just on this point you raised about why there's a kind of flourishing of perceptions of evil. There are many reasons, but one reason it seems to me is that we have a view of a world out of control, where, if you like, shit happens, and that evil becomes a way of explaining the inexplicable in a world which appears increasingly out of our control, over which we cannot either change things or explain why these kinds of things happen. It happens because of evil, whether you're Fred West or whoever. I'm not suggesting that just go back to something that Mark said, that in creating boundaries, or in talking about evil, one necessarily renders it inexplicable. But the point is that is not only the danger, but that historically that has been the case. Because even within the theology that Mark talks about, Aquinas and so on, there is a tendency to see evil as a kind of blankness. There's a contrast between good, which can be understood in human terms, human words, explained and so on in human words, and evil, which is some kind of blankness. And in talking about evil as the absence of good, what it's doing is actually saying it is that blankness, and therefore renders it inexplicable in its own terms.
But that sort of leads me on to the question that I'm struggling with. I mean, if we are prone to see evil in the world more, maybe because we live in a world of increasing uncertainty and old moral absolutes don't have force, and it certainly is true. I mean, we tend to have a rather low view of humanity at the moment. Either, you know, the human being is a carbon emitter, which is a form of original sin. You can't escape, or they're a greedy, self-interested banker just out to screw you over, or the human being is just meat, sort of in Simon's view. It's I won't do the science thing, but it's neurons and genes again explaining this. But the essence of humanity in these discussions seems to be relatively less on the table than it used to be. Very different from the view, say, of the Catholic philosopher Pascal, who said man is neither angel nor brute, but did recognise the ability to move up the ladder to the side of the angels, or down to the level of brutish behaviour. But contemporary explanations leave maybe less room for that process of bettering yourself morally, or going the other way, and have more reductionist explanations of the complexity of morality. But here's my question: if that's right, does not, paradoxically, or in a way, seeing the world and human beings in that way create evil? Does that not, that reduction of complexity, actually bring in the view for evil, or the place for evil? Not just in the way you're describing it, Kenan, but actually maybe make it more likely in the world if we see such a low view of man. So very brief thoughts in any order, and then we'll go out to the audience.
Well, maybe just to say that, again, just to respond to a reflection of Simon's beginning, he said that you feel that the trouble with evil is a bit of a circular argument. And I would deny that, because I think that the measure is actually a conception of the good life, what life might be. You know, in Aristotelian terms, that would be in relation to flourishing. In Christian terms, that would be in relation to theology and the divine conception of what we're made for, if you like. Now, it's very difficult to do that. I'm not denying it's difficult to come up with a conception of the good life, but it's not a circular argument. And I sometimes feel, just to come back to your point, Angus, that we grasp at the more reductionist views because we're too nervous, really, in a plural society for sometimes quite obvious reasons, at trying to describe what the good life might be. Liberalism has left us with this legacy of saying we won't tell other people, as it were, what we think might be the case. We'll just kind of back off and get on with our own life. And I think that perhaps that's why evil, as it were, really rushes into that vacuum, if you like, which is perhaps partly what was talking about Kenan as well.
I mean, I agree with that in a sense. I think it's easier to define evil than it is to define the good. And in a time where, as you said, I agree with you, that we're less willing to be certain about what constitutes a good life, it becomes easier to define what it is not than what it is, which is, seems to me another reason for we think more in terms of evil than we do in terms of good.
Just on Pascal, with neither angel nor brute, though that's true, I think it's not that angels are good and brutes are bad, because Satan is an angel. That is to say, there are kinds of evil which are not to do with having bodies. There's kind of evil which is to do with being malicious or envious, or having a more intellectual kind of voice. And the diabolic kind of evil is worse than the self-indulgent or the aggressive kind of evil, at least traditionally so. And the danger of identifying what's bad with the brute is that we tend to then start hating our bodies, which is something that has sometimes happened in Christianity, and that would be a bad thing, I think. So we've got to be, there are consequences to how we identify what's evil, and if we identify what's evil with just part of us, we end up, I think, causing harm.
So Simon quickly, and then.
Yeah, Angus, I think you're concerned that in today's science, the concept of evil is going to get reduced, so reductionism, and maybe its complexity is going to get lost. And I would argue that science is in the business of reductionism. It does try to take phenomena and try to identify the components that might be drivers of that phenomenon. But I don't think, if we look at something like empathy, we're going to end up with a very simple model, because empathy turns out to be very complex. So we've heard a little bit about in-groups and out-groups, that you can have empathy for your next of kin, but not for maybe somebody who's not in your group. So empathy turns out to be a function of a relationship that you're in, rather than necessarily used equally towards anyone that you come across. So there's a complexity about in-groups and out-groups. And there's a complexity about how your empathy can be affected by many other factors. Emotional factors like envy, or anger, or stress. You can lose your empathy temporarily, as well as neurologically, where your empathy may be at a lower level in more endurant ways.
Okay, so the more complex empathy is, the better it is, which sounds all right. As long as we can't get it on a dissecting table, I'm happy. So take a hand here, and then lady there, and then I'll go over this way, so people ready with the mics. So, do you want to just wait for the mic?
How about that when nobody has said, surely the reason we want morality is forms of protection. You need to protect yourself against forms of attack. And this discussion made me think, I wonder, how about discussing evil as forms of enslavement, and of which murder is the ultimate example, and that our attempts to get rid of slavery, which is what we've been trying to do for hundreds of years, and having some partial success, is an attempt to tackle that evil.
I like that idea. Evil is the absence of freedom. Lady here, could you pass the mic along? And then in the front row, there are two here.
Yeah. So I was really interested with this idea that I think is fairly universal across the panel of evil as an absence of something. Evil as an absence of empathy, evil as an absence of good, or perhaps evil as an absence of moral acceptability. And I was just thinking, is there anything else about evil? Is evil really just this thing that if we don't have certain checks in place will happen? Or is there something that evil brings to the table that good doesn't have? Or what we might define as evil? And, if we don't have empathy, or if we don't have something else, are we just doomed to do evil things? Or is there something about evil as well that we can characterise as more than an absence? I think that might be an interesting thing to explore.
So that's the what's good about evil question. Just here at the front, and then next to.
Can there ever be a universal morality, or is there one inherent in humans, or does it mean we need to eradicate differences between people, maybe cultural, national, social and economic things first?
I've got a less important point for David and a more important point for Simon. My point to David is you do Lord of the Rings a disservice. It promulgates a Boethian conception, not a Manichaean conception of evil, as your fellow Catholic Tolkien would tell you. My more important point to Simon. Simon, my wife has a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, and for all her difficulties, which sadly prevent her from being here today, the suggestion in your book that she's on a footing with the perpetrators of the Holocaust did not go down very well with her. And I just wonder whether, by conflating different forms of judgment, medical judgment, moral judgment, and legal judgment, whether by failing to make the proper distinctions between those things, maybe you might be, and I choose my words carefully, on a road to perdition.
Okay, so there's a hand in the back with the microphone, and then keep your hands up for a minute while he's speaking, so I'll take a couple more.
I've also got a question for Simon, or several. The first is, Simon, I presume you accept, sorry I'm here, that not all that matters in life can be measured. And secondly, not all, not everything is a component of the human mind. You know, taxation can actually be measured, but I don't see any genetic basis for it, or basis for it in how I was brought up as a child, or NATO as a concept. So presumably you would accept that some things are not scientific constructs, but social constructs. And are you not then making a category error by trying to explain a social construct, evil, using scientific terms? And even if, as you persist, and you mentioned several times measuring empathy, what is the unit of empathy? That will help me really get a handle on this. Presumably, what you're really looking at is associations of things, not causations. I mean, neuroscience, for all the new insights it brings, is still a fairly fledgling and limited science, I would suggest. If I observe the Empire State Building at night with all the lights on, or whatever, and I let off a bomb to the side of it, maybe some of the lights will go off as people try to see what's going on there. But it doesn't tell me, seeing lights going on and off does not tell me what's really going on inside the building, nor indeed what caused the lights to go on and off. So really, as I think David suggested, you're just regressing the explanation to another absence of explanation.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple more quick points and then bring the panel in for quick thoughts, because there are lots of hands still. So there's a paper in the air, and then a gentleman in front of him, and then afterwards I'll come back to this.
I'm feeling as though we're not being very empathetic to Simon, because I'd like to push you a little bit further.
I'll give him a hug after this.
Okay, thank you. I went to my hometown a couple of weeks ago, and in the pub I met a guy who I last saw in 1988, who was a bit of an evil shit actually, and had lamped me. And we met, and you know, we had a chat, and nice guy, and shared a drink together, and went over old school days. So I'd like to push you on this idea of empathy and the degrees of empathy. So something's happened there where that individual's empathy levels, however you measure them, or the unit, has changed, if we take your argument. So my question really is, do levels of empathy or degrees of empathy change? If so, how, why, and when?
Taking up on that point, being empathetic, have we got any questions for David?
Okay, it seems to me that there's kind of a consensus forming here, but I'm not sure that all the panelists recognise it. Mark, I assume you believe it's wrong to call a person evil.
No.
You do, because you believe with sorry, I will explain. You agree with Aquinas. Aquinas said that evil is the absence of all good, but as a Christian you can't believe that anyone lacks good completely. They were created by God. So you actually agree with Simon. And likewise, Kenan, do you think that describing a person as evil demeans the complexity of the person? It's a way of placing them beyond the realm of discussion. In other words, if you're saying that people are that simple, that they can just be evil, it's you that's reducing the argument, not Simon. And so you have a consensus. Ideas may be evil, because ideas may be uniformly awful. But if you say that people are evil, then you're saying that people are capable of extreme simplicity, and you're arguing that extreme simplicity is a bad thing in this argument.
Okay, so I'm going to let the panelists come back on any, all, or some of the points. Quickly, though, so we can come back out, because there are lots more hands, so would you like to go first?
Well, I could just quickly respond to that, perhaps. I think there's a difference between an evil nature, if you like, and an evil act. And as I understand it, also Aquinas would say that God created creation and human beings fundamentally good, but because of this business of freedom, and because of this business of the fragility of life, everyone is capable of evil acts. Which another way of putting it is that we have responsibility for what we do. But the fact that creation is created good means there's always hope. And of course that is very important in the Christian understanding of the world, that there's always a hope of redemption. So that perhaps clarifies something of what I was trying to say.
hold our ideas an axiom, not them.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've got to be responsible though, so it's not, I don't think we should, you know, if you do something that's wrong, you don't say it was my brain that made me do it or something. That's to sort of reduce your responsibility. So I think in that sense, you could still say someone's been evil if they've done something that's evil. And I think that'd be an important thing to hold on to.
Okay, let's let the other panelists come back in. Which is precisely why I have trouble with the argument, with the idea that evil is the absence of good. Somebody there suggests that we all agree with that. I don't. And it seems the reason I don't agree with it is that it takes agency out of the picture. That there is a sense in which what we call evil. Part of the problem, as I said, in discussing evil, is that we're talking about different things. I'm quite happy to say this idea or that person is evil. But that's just a colloquial way of talking about great wickedness, if you know, or something that's very, 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 very bad. But what the interesting thing about evil, it seems to me, is at a different register, at a different level of why we use it of evil to set boundaries and what it means for our discussion of morality. And one of the problems, it seems to me, is that in discussing, think about evil as an absence of good, we take the kind of notion of self-willed bad acts, evil acts, out of the picture. Or not out of the picture, but it makes it more difficult to think about it. I mean, Kant made a point about talking about radical evil, which was meant to be a kind of counterpoint to the notion of original sin, that is not something that one inherits, but one self-wills. I think that it's interesting because there's both a useful and a not so useful aspect of it. I mean, it's useful precisely because it introduces the notion of agency. Before Martin Bailey says that, I know agency is the heart of Christian ideas of evil, but it's much more. There's a kind of complicated story there. But the point about Kantian notion of radical evil is that it is self-willed evil. But the problem is that that very notion of agency is itself a problem, because Kant sees, as many people do, agency in terms of the individual himself. That it is the agency of the isolated individual. And of course, people don't come into the world as isolated individuals; they come into the world as social actors. And therefore, when we're talking about agency, we're talking about not about the agency of the individual as an isolated actor. We're talking about the agency of we're talking about the relationship between the individual agent and the social framework within which he or she grew up. And I think part of the problem is that we tend to do one or the other. To say this is a question of agency, this is a question of society. Rather than think of it in terms that you can talk about agency, but also talk about that relationship, agency growing out of that relationship between the individual and the society in which that individual lives.
Before I bring you both in, I just want to slightly abuse my position on this, because what I'm confused about and want us to think about when we go back out again is which comes first, right? Is talking about evil leading to a reduction in agency, as Kenan's arguing, or is there more evil in the world because we have less agency? Right? So maybe a chicken and egg, but hopefully you know what I mean. Because whenever anybody talks about free will these days, it's always in a disparaging way, so-called free will. And we'll find a gene or a neuron, don't pick me up on it, Simon, for it pretty soon, I'm sure. And so, what comes first? Do we have a low view, a lack of faith in human reason and judgment, which brings us into that moral relativism question? We live in an avowedly non-judgmental society, where it's a virtue to be non-judgmental. Is it possible that living in that kind of society actually opens the door to vice?
David? One of the consequences of being non-judgmental society, of course, is we cast very severe judgments on people who cast judgments. And I've lost my track now. So I had a thought and I'll come back.
Okay. Can I just first of all respond to some of the points that came from the audience? First of all, Sandy, about borderline personality disorder. So this is a psychiatric condition, many of you will know, where people have difficulty with impulse control. So at times in their relationships they can manage when they're not being stressed, and that they can show empathy, and that they are capable of the full range of social behaviour. But at other times when they are stressed, they can lose their trust for other people. They can feel threatened by other people, and they can lash out so that love turns to hate in seconds. And it is very terrifying for people who are all around them when that happens. And so that their behaviour is no longer social but antisocial. And you know, an example of a woman who had this condition who I met in my clinic was someone who was a very capable mother when she was calm. But as soon as she felt her child was not doing what the child was told, so challenging her authority as a parent, she would lash out verbally, saying, "I hate you," to her child. Saying, "I hate you," and then saying, you treat me like shit, and I'm going to kill myself. Saying that to a 10-year-old child, you know, I mean, now I wouldn't say that she was evil when she did that, but the words landing on the ears of that child would have been very hurtful. And the argument is that in people with borderline personality disorder, there are times when their empathy fluctuates, so that they lose sight of the impact of their words and their actions on another person. It's not that that was what was happening in the concentration camps, it's just one example of factors that can influence your empathy.
David, quickly, and then we'll go to you.
Yeah, I remember what I was going to say. I was going to bring up character, because I think that when we think about the difference between evil acts and evil people, why we would want to call people evil, as I think is reasonable to do sometimes, is because of that, not because of that act, but because of their character. Because the act is typical of a kind of character, and a character, not just any character, but a character which is developed by such acts. So it is because somebody has become that kind of person by certain kinds of acts that we can say this is something about the person, not just about the act. So a person can be cruel, not just an act. It's possible for a person to become cruel. And if a person has become cruel by actions which are free actions, then they are partly responsible for that cruelty. And so that becomes a moral judgment. That's why we're making a moral judgment. Because we're making a judgment on character. And this is kind of Aristotelian account, and if that's all we had, then I think that it would be pretty depressing, which is why at least those who are Christian are helped by thinking that there could be some redemption. Because if you don't think that somebody could come in and redeem that, there is a problem of vicious circle, literally vicious circle, vice leading to vice. But that's why I think we call people vicious, or wicked, or malicious, because their character has become so.
Okay, we're going to move into sort of rapid fire mode now, so we can get lots of you in. So let's go over here. So there, and then in front of you. Yes.
Okay, thanks. I'm quite interested in the idea that there's something especially incomprehensible about evil that's not captured in the concept of badness, even extreme badness, or moral wrongness, or serious wrongness. And there seem to be two ways in which that can manifest itself. There's the banality idea that Hannah Arendt made popular with the observation of the Eichmann trial, this fussy bureaucrat concerned about the trains running on time, who was responsible for the organising the Holocaust. But then there's the satanic idea that David talked about. I mean, you find this in fiction and in plays and so on. The idea that the evil person is somebody who in some profound way understands goodness much better than the rest of us, rather like the fallen archangel whom Satan is supposed to be, who is in a very strange way close to God. And you find that in fanaticism, perhaps, in the actual world. People who have a very, very pure idea of a moral ideal that leads them to terrorism. And I wonder what thoughts people have about these different ways in which ordinary evil is distinct from ordinary badness.
Okay, thank you. And then yes.
Then
we'll come down here. Yeah.
My feeling was that the speakers in general really have misunderstood Simon's point about empathy. So I was wondering if I could, my understanding of it a little bit, and then ask him to pick up and clarify if that is the case. The point that I think is they've taken empathy as a very, very simplistic sort of mechanical idea only in all the arguments and all the kind of disparagement of what he's been saying. Actually, I think he did really distinguish with the cognitive and the affective element. You know, the cognitive element being a measurable capacity, a human psychological capacity. The affective point, the bit I suppose he would like to ask more about, seems to me to be the value-laden point, not something you can measure in that point, and that's where morality comes in, because there's no necessarily capacity or sense, and just because I understand your point of view that I choose to act in that way. That's when we get into rationalism versus, you know, universal ethics in that point. If there are universal ethics, well then it does become a measurable capacity. If there aren't universal ethics along the kind of points that Kenan is making, then morality and affective empathy becomes a perfectly reasonable constitutive element of that. And you know, where you reduced Simon's point to empathy brings out a dehumanizing element. Well, not in the slightest, because the difference between myself and a chimp is that I can empathise in a different way. My levels of being able to empathise, the difference between a rabbit and a chimp is its ability to empathise. All of those moral choices, why are we happier testing rats, not chimps, is because rats have less empathy, so less able to consider that and understand the hurt that we inflict on them. So, you know, empathy becomes moral in all those elements. So, where, you know, rationalism, or relativism, sorry, then brings that in, is if I've got Simon's understanding of effective empathy right, and how that goes. Is that...
Yeah, no, it's very clear where it's wrong. I mean, chimps don't have free will, but never mind. So, down here, the whole little cluster here. Well, do you want to speak?
Earlier on, the chair said that maybe we're looking for more moral absolutes these days, but maybe, as described about our views now of the Holocaust and what they might have been 1,000 years ago, perhaps some of us are simply trying to shift the boundaries of what we call moral and what we don't. Sometimes people were talking on the panel about evil as being beyond reason, but, and someone else mentioned terrorist. I think sometimes people do use reason a lot to justify what many of us would call absolutely wrong, if we're going to have any absolutes. For instance, if someone gets on a bus full of school children and deliberately blows them and himself up, that's a deliberate and absolute action. He knows what he's doing. Of course, he might have been programmed and so on, but then there are the onlookers, other people who might not actually do the be perpetrators, but stand aside and condone it, and not look at the action, but hey, what's he really doing it for? We're with the cause, so we can see them, if you like, as condoning this evil.
Okay, so let's try and make very quick, snappy contributions now, because we will run out of time and not have people in. So there's a hand here and then behind. Well, there's three here, and then I'll come over to this side.
Okay, I've got a quick question for anybody to comment on, and that is, if you think of torturers, whether they're Spanish inquisitors or American waterboarders, are they evil? So the question, can you, by your own criteria of what you consider to be evil, how would you judge them?
Okay, good question. A couple more, or there, yes, here and then
this may be quite a broad question, but going back to Simon's point about the experiment between twins, is there a difference between levels of morality and empathy between male and females? I know, of course, it depends on, you know, your mental state and whatnot, but is there any key significance or difference between them? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so you, sir, and then a couple of hands down here, right in front of me.
I just wanted to press Kenan, if I can, on the meta-ethics question. Susan Neiman, in her fantastic book Moral Clarity, raises a point about when we came to a consensus against slavery. She said, did we come to that consensus because we'd recognised some new facts about the world that we hadn't previously, or is that some freestanding moral judgment that we've made? If it's a freestanding moral judgment, how do we come to that if it's irrespective of facts?
Okay, so you, sir, and then just behind you.
I think this is a question largely for Simon as to whether, whether low empathy can be a force for good. It seems to me what's so frightening about the Milgram experiment is that we get a lot of our sense of good and evil from those around us, presumably because we're sort of a herd animals. And sometimes those with a lesser sense of peer pressure, perhaps a lesser sense of empathy, find it easier to stand firm. For instance, the example you gave standing against apartheid South Africa.
Yes, so behind you and then behind you again.
I want to start with transcendence, because I think implicit in all of this is the idea of transcendence and descendance into something other than the transcendent. That's the first point. The second point is in terms of the West's and the destruction of their house, that's some sort of symbolized exorcism which raises the question as to whether it's effective. And the third thing is Darren Brown's program last night, which suggests that evil is not something of the individual, but rather of the collective.
God, I wish I could start with transcendence. I thought it was funny.
My question relates to human individuality and creativity that Kenan raised, because in terms of human nature has classically been seen as of nature, but also going beyond nature. But in many discussions today, we have a reversal where the transcendent aspect of humanity is seen as problematic and potentially evil.
Okay, can I just see what hands we've got left? So, there and then... Good.
Hi. I just want to say I think moral relativism hasn't had a lot of support, maybe indirectly from what Simon has said, but I think it has a lot going for it in terms of just providing a less charged basis for people discussing different points of view.
Okay, thanks. Then you, and then we'll run over here, and then we'll be looking to grab up, I think.
Okay, thanks. I just think a distinction needs to be made between necessary and sufficient conditions for choices to do evil. Because though biological and certain social factors might be necessary, and I do think the social factors have been underappreciated in this. If you look at the Rwandan genocide and dehumanisation of the minority groups, the cockroaches, for instance, to reduce empathy within those groups, might have been a causal factor. But regardless of whether these conditions are necessary, I think certain extra steps need to be made before you start classifying those conditions as sufficient. The reason being perfectly given by the man in the front row, whose wife does have one of these conditions. Because once you start classifying these people as evil, what you're doing is you're classifying these people on the basis of their conditions, regardless of the acts which they've actually chosen to perpetrate.
Yes, thanks. And there's a hand here. Any more? For any more? Okay. Good. Yes. I can't see through that pillow, so.
Yeah, my point was, can two acts of evil actually make something good? For example, if I was to kill a murderer, then technically society would see both acts individually, the act of the murderer as evil, and my act for killing him as evil. Well, there again, would society see it as good, such as the guy that slashed Huntley's throat and the public went, well, good. Surely his act was evil too.
Okay. Did you have your hand up? Yeah. And then I'll bring you back in.
I guess I wanted to ask if empathy could be taught, because you talk about people having different levels, but also what kind of empathy we should have for people we label as evil as well, if that makes sense.
Yes, no, absolutely. Okay, thank you. I'll ask the speakers to sum up, and then I've got a couple of quick announcements, so don't run out too quickly. Mark, would you mind?
Well, just to maybe respond to a couple of the points. I think that generic cases, is the torturer evil? It's very difficult to determine on the count of evil that I understand anyway. I saw a little boy just yesterday squashing a ladybird in the street. And I walked past, and I was glad that when he looked up, he looked slightly shocked at what he'd done. And I thought, you're not evil. You've done a bad thing, but you're not evil. Had he looked up with a kind of, glee, and as it were, looking for the next ladybird, I would have been in more trouble. So, and this, in some more psychological terms, is to say that primary symptoms can have very different secondary meanings. And this is, I think, one of the challenges with the brain science, is that the same symptom, as it were, can mean very, very different things. It's often very hard to determine what is meant beneath the surface. And I also very much like Kenan's point about the social nature of things too. And I think that's partly why we should care about the discussion of evil in our society, because whilst we do have responsibility, it's something we learn in a collective sense. While we do have freedom, a lot of our freedom, I think, is to do with what we receive and how we pass it on. It's that sort of action where our freedom comes in, and discussions about character and so on relate to that as well. We learn things from our groups, so we should care about our society, both in terms, say, of our friendships, but also about the society in which we live. And I would argue still that having a discussion about evil is one way that we can actually care about our society, and so be caring about ourselves as well.
Thanks, Mike. Let me begin with a question that somebody over there raised about slavery and the rise of opposition to slavery, and where did that come from? New facts, new moral judgment, and so on. I think part of the problem in thinking about morality is that we tend to think of it as, falling from the sky, or there's a tendency to think of as isolated from social, political, economic developments in society. And the point about morality is that morality is very much part and parcel of moral development, is very much part and parcel of social, political, economic development. And you can see that very clearly with respect to the challenge to slavery, which is that it is the changing social, political, economic circumstances from the 16th to the 20th century that created the opportunities, the possibilities. First, of thinking of humans as in a different way than previously. And secondly, of actually being able to do something about it in practical terms. Jonathan Israel, in his books on Enlightenment, makes the point that there's a distinction to be drawn between the mainstream Enlightenment and the radical Enlightenment. The mainstream Enlightenment, the ones whom we know, are the ones who broadly sought to marry the changing views about equality, of freedom and so on, with old social structures and old theological arguments. Whereas the radical Enlightenment, people like Spinoza and Dolbach and so on, because they jettisoned that, the way he puts it is that they had no grounding for morality apart from the idea of the complete equality of human beings. And many of the ideas then that arise out of that, but arise out of the consequences of grounding morality in the idea of human equality, of the complete equality of human being. But the point is that they were able to do so. Those ideas didn't simply come out of the sky. Those ideas were part and parcel of the changing development, political, economic, social development of Europe in the 17th, 18th and 19th century. So there's a part of the problem, I think, which is what I was trying to say before, is that the discussion of evil takes that discussion out of historical, social, political development, and we would see both the discussion about evil and the discussion of morality in that context.
Okay, thank you. David, your last thought. For today. For today. Firstly, I'd actually like to challenge, which I did before, the claim that Hitler wouldn't have been seen so bad 1,000 years ago. I think the massacring of civilians has always been seen as bad, and certainly on that kind of scale. Actually, things were much worse in the 20th century than they were in the Middle Ages. And they're not only worse with respect to Hitler, but they're also worse in the 17th century than they were in the Middle Ages with respect to slavery. And one of the reasons I think that we came to a consensus eventually about slavery because it was the slave trade, which was a relatively new, so modern thing, which was just so shocking that it shocked people out of thinking that this might be a nice institution, this might be an institution that you can reconcile yourself with if you treat your slave nicely.
which was a sort of old view, that was just not possible to think in relation to the slave trade. So it was a learning experience through something which was very harrowing. Maybe the Holocaust has the same kind of effect, but we're slow to learn these lessons because we think a group of children on a bus who are killed for some greater good is a terrible evil act. But of course, there's children in buses in Hiroshima. You know, there were children in buses in Hiroshima, and so it's not only the terrorists these days who commit such acts, but all such acts, I say, are evil.
Simon, leave us with one thing.
Well, just to say that I think the audience has been fantastic. We've heard some really great points. I wish I could respond to some or all of them. It's just a few, picking a few out. First of all, the idea that people with borderline personality disorder are evil. I would say that I would not endorse that view. What I've been trying to argue is that people with specific medical conditions can lose their empathy under certain conditions, and that when we take that medical view, actually we end up with more compassion for those individuals rather than condemning them or saying that they are evil. The second thing is the idea of agency and free will, which we haven't given a lot of space to. But if we take Breivik in Norway, who committed these murders, you know, arguably he made his choices. He wrote his manifesto over a 10-year period, and so he was plotting very carefully what he was going to do, driven by his ideology. And we don't know, we haven't had a psychiatric assessment of this individual yet, but one possibility is that although he was acting under apparent free will, he was making his choices, if he had low empathy for his victims, for the families of his victims, arguably his choices were blunted by what he couldn't appreciate. He couldn't necessarily see the emotional states of his victims or of their families.
Okay, so Simon is going to be signing copies of his book afterwards upstairs in Foles Bookshop in the Exhibition Centre. Otherwise, I mean, that's the beginning of this strand, sort of a morning's moral workout, warm-up on evil.